Welcome to theAnalysis-news. I'm filmmaker Barry Stevens. In a few seconds, I'm going to be joined by Paul Jay, the senior editor of The Analysis, to talk about 2025, an extraordinary year that's just coming to an end. There's a donate button on the analysis page, and if you like, you can subscribe. In a few seconds, I'm going to be joined by Paul Jay. Paul is a documentary filmmaker and television producer with decades of experience. Right now he's working on a documentary called How to Stop a Nuclear War, based on the experience and wisdom of the late Daniel Ellsberg. He's the originator, senior editor, and sometime host and interviewer on The Analysis. But today he's the interviewee, and we're going to be talking about this past extraordinary year of 2025. Paul, 331 days ago, Donald Trump was inaugurated as the 47th president of the United States. And the last year has been overwhelming in terms of news, often driven by Trump. But it's easy to get caught up in the daily shocks, the social media posts, the personality, the chaos on the surface. But beneath the noise, a lot of big forces seem to be moving at once, geopolitically, economically, and socially, in ways that aren't always obvious when you're just following headlines. So I'd like to step back and invite you to look under the surface a little more structurally at this tumultuous year, and in four parts. What's happening in South America, the war in Ukraine, thirdly, what's unfolding inside the United States itself, and maybe finally where countries like Canada fit into all this. So we'll start with South America. Now, there's a big naval flotilla right now in the Caribbean. The president has called the president of Venezuela, Maduro, stupid, a head of a terrorist organization. The Secretary of War, as he's now styling himself, ordered the blowing up of civilian boats in international waters, which is a crime, calling them narco-terrorists without any evidence. The President of the United States has declared, I think, what is it, yesterday, I believe, or maybe even this morning, a blockade of oil tankers, and they have previously seized an oil tanker. Now, it's been 36 years since the U.S. invaded a Latin American country, also apparently over drugs. But what do you think Washington is really trying to achieve in South America right now, and why?
Well, I think probably this is true what I'm about to say for most elites, but it's certainly true for the American elites. Ever since, at the very least, the end of World War II and the Cold War, they kind of really believe that everything they would like to do and would do and do if they can, the other side, meaning their enemies or adversaries, have similar ambitions. So they always thought the Soviet Union wanted to take over the world using military means. When I say they, that's what they told the American people, even though the CIA was telling them it wasn't true. But I think a lot of the political military elites believed it was true because it was true about them. And I think they thought if we want to do it, they must want to do it. And I think we're seeing that now. The great fear of United States and the elites, or at least the preponderance, is that China will use its power in the South China Sea, in Asia, to essentially push the United States out. Even though the Americans consider Asia, and certainly have even from before World War II, but certainly since, Asia is part of an American sphere of influence. And the idea that, or the perceived threat that China might want to push the US out, it's because that's something the Americans would do if they could, and now they're trying to, which I mean is Latin America. So the idea that Venezuela, what's happening with Venezuela, or even letting this guy out on a pardon.
The former president of Honduras.
Yeah. So clearly, one of the modus operandi of the Cold War is you establish a pretext for military intervention. And the pretext can be Soviet military expansionism, which more than less never existed. The pretext can be Saddam Hussein has weapons of mass destruction, which we knew that he didn't. And now the pretext is drugs. That China is facilitating fentanyl exports, and even if they are to some extent, that's certainly not the reason why they're going after Venezuela, because Venezuela isn't the place that fentanyl's coming from. The cocaine in the boats that they stopped, apparently the reporting is it actually was meant for Europe or somewhere else, not even to the United States.
That's assuming, of course, that they were in fact drug boats, because I do know that along the northern coast of Colombia, at least, and I think in Venezuela, obviously in Venezuela, there are actually fishermen or people who transport around, carry people around. Since there was zero evidence of it, they may very well have been drugs, but
yeah, well,
we don't know that because they never stopped
let's
them.
assume they're drug boats, just for the sake of argument. Who knows what the truth of it is? But it's possible they are. But that isn't the point. The point is there's a long history in U.S. foreign policy and military aggression of using pretexts. I mean, there's even this document called Operation Northwood, which was part of the Cuban Missile Crisis that was created by the Joint Chiefs of Staff, signed off by every member of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, including the chair, handed to Kennedy, where it recommended all kinds of batshit crazy false flag operations, shooting down planes and pretending it's full of American students when it was actually a kind of a drone. I mean, the kind of stuff in that document is crazy. But the document actually begins with the paragraph: our objective is to find justification and a pretext, actually use the word pretext, for invading Cuba. Now, that was declassified just a few years ago. So it's more than obvious that what's going on here is a pretext. And if the blockade itself is a war crime, it's an act of war. Killing people in these boats without any kind of due process is a war crime. And even people on the Hill in the Democratic Party, and even a couple of Republicans like Rand Paul, are saying it. Now, if it was a Democratic president doing these things, and I wouldn't put it beyond many of the corporate Democrats that might have been president to do it, but it's a Republican and the Democrats are speaking out. So what's really going on here? The Chinese Revolution in 1949 was a tremendous break with the plans of the post-World War II world of the United States. There was something called the Grand Area the Council on Foreign Relations had planned out in collaboration with the State Department. And the fundamental thesis, and it continues to this day, but in those days it was, no country should leave the American global financial architecture, should leave the American sphere of influence and join either the Soviet Union in one way or the other, or even become independent, like, for example, the overthrow of the Iranian President Mossadegh in 1953, who was not a socialist or communist. He just wanted the Iranians to control their own oil supply. Right from that date to today, the American fundamental position is you must stay within the American globally managed capitalist system. And if you don't, we will overthrow you, usually covertly, sometimes just spending tons of money on opposition parties, or sometimes through direct military intervention, whether it's Korea or Vietnam or Iraq. So what's happening in Venezuela is part of this pattern. What's specific about it is that China has, without any military projection, global military projection, actually more or less won the commercial competition in Latin America. China is the #1 trading partner of Brazil, and I believe the majority of the countries of Latin America. They already have essentially defeated the United States, at least for now. They're flooding South America with Chinese-made EVs, electric vehicles, and many, many other products. And they, to a large extent, pushed American products out of many of the Latin American markets. They're even competing on the finance side, although the US, I believe, still has the upper hand. But they're giving countries, especially countries that are not in the American sphere at all, really, like a Venezuela, like a Cuba, they're giving them alternative sources of funding, of financing, and they're offering this to other countries as well. This is breaking the whole monopoly of the United States over Latin America, which is the objective of the Monroe Doctrine. And this isn't just questions, an issue of policy. This goes to the fundamental DNA core, and not just of American capitalism, but specifically because for geographical and historical reasons, US and South America is dominant. Monopoly. Capitalism gravitates towards monopoly. It doesn't gravitate towards, let's have a nice competition. Competition that's even at all fair has to be imposed through antitrust legislation, which has gotten weaker and weaker domestically in the US. But as much as each individual corporation seeks monopoly, states seek monopoly. And if you're in the geographical, historical, if you got dealt the right cards, then you strive for global monopoly. And if you're, say, like we're both in Canada, so Canada didn't get dealt those cards, didn't have the population size and so on. But so we get, Canada rides the gravy train as much as it can of the American seeking of monopoly and plundering of the world in various ways. So what's going on in Venezuela is not about drugs. It's certainly not about democracy and elections, because if they cared a whit about that, they wouldn't be so buddy-buddy with Saudi Arabia and the rest of the Gulf states. There's a history of dictatorship after dictatorship since World War II being imposed in the name of fighting against communism, but more importantly, for freedom. I mean, it just reeks of hypocrisy. But decades and decades of pounding this Cold War propaganda, and it's still working now. There's just recently, maybe we'll talk about this more later, on the day Mondami visits Trump, there's a crazy resolution in the House against socialism. I mean, where's the great threat of socialism here? Like what, one mayor in New York, one in Seattle, but they really are afraid. And so when Trump says about Venezuela, and I'll stop after this, we want back what you stole from us, our oil and our land. In other words, the American investments that were nationalized under Chavez. And some of it was even nationalized before Chavez, which nobody wants to talk about. That's the great crime. Anything that smells of being socialistic, nationalistic, that isn't under the American thumb, it's always been the great enemy. And now, and this strategy was enunciated at least overtly in 2023 in a document from the Heritage Foundation, which was titled "Winning the New Cold War." And it's explicitly about pushing China out of Latin America. Project 2025 says essentially the same thing, and the new NSS document explicitly says the same thing. So this is all about China.
Just to clarify a couple of things, to say that you call them war crimes, those blowing up of boats. Technically not, because there's no war. So they say there's a war, but there's not, and that's actually an important point. But it is a crime. Clearly, they're international waters. There's no charge. There's no court case. They're just killed. But they have labeled it a war already.
Yeah, but just
a war on drugs.
I don't think that's what I said. I said the blockade is a war crime. The blockade is an act of war.
A blockade is an act of war. Yes. No, I'm not. The reason I mention that is because part of this is framed as we're already at a war, in a war, and that will of course justify all kinds of things. There is of course a terribly long history of United States Yankee gringo interference or military action in the region. Cuba, of course, you cited, is a very famous example, and in fact, the Northwoods program was followed by the Mongoose program, where they actually did a lot of that shit. But there's also, of course, Guatemala in 1953, the same year, or more or less within a year of the Iranian overthrow, which you referred to. And in Guatemala, that was about the government seizing or taking or compensating some lands from United Fruit Company. And that triggered a CIA overthrow. That's just one example, of course, of many, many, many of these. But it's been quite a while, Paul. It's been 1989 was the Panama seizure of Noriega. And now Latin America has developed a lot. There's a powerful middle class. They're richer. They're probably better educated. They're certainly not going to take this lying down. So how do you think that's going to play out in Latin America, these aggressive moves?
Yeah. Let me just say one thing first, which is the section of the right that are kind of anti-neocon in a way, even though their objectives are very similar. Many of them thought the Iraq War was a distraction. Many of them thought the focus on NATO and Europe was a distraction. Distraction from what? The fight with China. And they've been saying for quite a while, it even goes back before 2023, every America first, every American strategy, every piece of American foreign policy should start with China and then analyze how to fight with China. There was even a group in Washington years ago, and I don't know if it still exists. I think it was even called the Blue Group or something like that. And it was from both parties. And it was essentially to push this thesis that it doesn't matter what the foreign policy issue is, start with conflict with China and work backwards. And so why didn't they get to this sooner, this imposition of the Monroe Doctrine in Latin America? Well, I think it's two things. One is there's conflicting interests in the corporate elites, amongst capital, especially what are the more short-term interests of the military-industrial complex, the issue of oil in the Middle East, the issue of the influence of pro-Israeli policy, and so on and so on. The more narrow-focused vision on China would have been a little more accommodating to Russia and Europe in order to try to isolate and split Russia off from China. So there's a lot of conflicting interests going on amongst the American elites, and this particular group that's in power around Trump, they want to break from the old Council on Foreign Relations strategy, focus everything on, number one, push China out of Latin America, and two, then contend with China over Asia, because anyone that knows much about Latin America knows this is in all likelihood going to give rise to an impetus to the Latin American revolutionary movement. The Latin American people, including much of the Latin American elites, are absolutely don't want to go back to the days of American puppet dictators throughout the continent. And that seems to be the strategy. Go back to the, quote, good old days where Americans put into power who they wanted. They used lethal force and violence to suppress the people. And now they think, and this is maybe giving them new encouragement. This is where this thing ties into the new techno-militarized, techno-fascist state. These are companies like Palantir, Anduril, and others. They think now, using these new technologies, they will succeed in implementing dictatorships in Latin America where they failed in the past.
And sorry, is there evidence of that desire to install dictatorships, frankly said, anywhere in the documents? Well, I understand that the goal is dominance, and pushing out.
Well, they're doing it. They're not doing it. I'm not suggesting the plan is to do it through military force. The plan is to do it by interfering in elections. And they're doing it. They just did it in Chile. They're doing it in Honduras. I mean, they're going to use the money and military pressure And they're doing it in Venezuela. I mean, they're trying to institute regime change in Venezuela and put this woman that just won the Nobel Prize in power, who's promised to privatize everything. Like, every piece of nationalization that's gone on in Venezuela, she's said she's going to reverse. So, yeah, it's obvious they're doing it. You don't need a piece of evidence other than they're actually doing it. I'm not suggesting they're going to do it with troops, except even in Venezuela, I think it's far more likely they'll try to starve the place. It's a blockade, a siege, and they're hoping they're going to create something where the military creates a coup. Now, I have no idea what might succeed in Venezuela. Maduro isn't popular. I think the population's very split about Maduro. There's far more people who support Chavez but don't support Maduro. According to polling, there's quite a lot of those people. But what does that mean? I don't know. I think there is a kind of nationalism, certainly in the military, that they don't want the Americans coming in and telling them who their government is. I do know whether they succeed in the short term. Let's say they create such economic havoc in Venezuela that it does lead to the fall of Maduro. And I'm not predicting this because I really don't know. And I've been to Venezuela quite a few times, but not for years. But let's say that's not going to solve their problem. That's going to enrage the rest of Latin America. And in fact, some elections they might have been able to swing to the right might go in the other direction. I don't think they're going to wind up succeeding in this plan, but I think it's pretty clear this is the plan.
So let's talk about Maduro a little bit. There's credible evidence that he didn't win the last election. Certainly, various international groups who are more or less trustworthy around this said that he didn't. There are 8 million Venezuelans have left in this, well, I guess since Chavez, but especially during this period. They sit on these vast oil reserves. Why has it been so poorly managed? And this is not, my question is not to endorse, of course, the US bullying, but it's also not to make Maduro into some kind of angelic hero, because these things are complicated. Why is it such a mess, Venezuela?
Well, I can tell you the gist of what I know. I'm no expert on Venezuela, but I've been there. I know something about it. But first of all, the fundamental underpinnings of the mess is Chavez tried to create a form of socialism there. And the Venezuelan elites, backed by the United States, did absolutely everything they could to sabotage it, including an attempted coup, I think in 2002, sanctions, and you name it, every piece of sabotage they could. That's the external factor. The internal factor, from what I saw when I was there, and I've interviewed people about it over and over again, I think Chavez made some serious tactical and strategic errors. I don't think there was a very good plan how to transform the economy from a rentier oil-based economy and diversify it, diversify agriculture, and become more self-reliant in other kinds of products. I think they went way too fast. I think Chavez went after too many sectors of the economy at once instead of focusing on reforming the oil sector.
He also said that Bush was the devil when he went to the United Nations. It was foolishness.
Yeah, unnecessarily provocative. I think he saw it as a way to rally his base and to rally Latin America, and it did to people that already supported him, but unnecessarily put him in the crosshairs of the Americans. And without Chavez's charisma and leadership, probably there never would have been that kind of government in the first place. So history, is what it is. That's where Venezuela was. He was the best choice at the time. I think he made some strategic errors.
Mm.
I don't think Chavez was corrupt. I got to know people who worked pretty closely with him, and I think he was doing his best. There was a lot of corruption in the army and the police force that he inherited and wasn't able to deal with. And maybe could he have done more? Maybe, I don't know. Like, it's very easy to sit, in North America and say, well, he could have done this, he could have done that. So Maduro gets handed a deck of cards, a hand. Trump likes to talk about the cards you're handed. Well, he was already handed an economy where the oil sector was very disorganized. Chavez fired hundreds and hundreds, I think over 1,000 people working in the oil sector because they opposed the reforms. Now, why did the oil sector need reforms? Because even though it had already been nationalized, and this is something Trump doesn't want to say, the Venezuelan oil company already was publicly owned. So it wasn't Chavez that, quote, stole the oil. There was still lots of private oil fields and private ownership, but the fundamental oil company, the main oil company, had already been nationalized. But
That's Citgo.
no,
Correct?
Citgo is the American,
okay.
the American company. PDVSA, I think, is what it's called. But what was happening is the elites were bilking it. So the state, the Venezuelan government prior to Chavez, was enabling the elites to charge ridiculous amounts for everything. It's like a Pentagon story where they charge $25,000 for a toilet seat. I mean, it's wasn't toilet seats, but it was every service, everything possible that PDVSA had to buy. The elites were way overcharging. The government wasn't stopping it. And it was the Venezuelan people were getting bilked. And it's one of the reasons people supported Chavez in the first place. But the way he went about the reform, I don't think was very smart. It was too dramatic. It was too quick. He fired a lot of people. And then the elites and then Americans used all this to keep undermining attempts to make more rational sense. Then after a while, there isn't as much capital to invest and so on. I mean, there's people that can tell this story, way better than I can. But I think Chavez tried to do too much too soon. I think he put a lot of effort. You can say it's laudable, creating a Bank of the South, helping to finance Bolivia. He gave cheap oil to Cuba. He wanted to share, the benefits of what at the time was, the high price of oil, and Venezuela was doing great. But they didn't prepare for a big downturn in the price of oil. And that happened. And they hadn't created enough diversified economy to sustain when the price of oil started really to tank for quite a while. And it upset all their budget projections. So, to a large extent, it's bad planning. It's also a country where I think Chavez had a lot of trouble getting people that were really technically skilled and qualified who weren't against his socialist project. He actually had to hire, even in foreign policy, he had to bring in people, leftists from other countries to come help because he couldn't trust his own civil service. It's a serious problem that happens in these kinds of revolutionary, transformations. So there were a lot of problems. Now, Maduro, I don't know why Maduro was the leader. There should have been, to my mind, a proper process to pick the next leader. There should have been an election. The party should have been a real party and should have had a convention and let the best person win. It shouldn't have been just handed over to the person Chavez thought most loyal. But he was sick. He'd faced a coup. There was constant threats on his life. It is what it is. It wasn't a country ready to proceed towards a kind of socialist model so quickly, which is in many ways what happened in the Soviet Union, but that's another story. So why
Yeah,
is it a mess? It's a mess because of external interference and domestic, an
bad
attempt to
leadership.
do something that they weren't ready for.
I asked Larry Wilkerson the other day, is it really all about oil? And he said, yes, it's all about oil. And he didn't believe it at first, but he was saying that so many of these conflicts are about oil. But the question could also be, you don't have to send an army to get oil. You just have to send a check, which is more or less what the Chinese do. So why not just make a deal and buy it?
Well,
That's
it's not even about buying oil because the most important part of the oil business is this heavy crude, and there's not many refineries that can deal with the crude.
Texas, there's the one, yes.
Well, that's the Koch brothers, and it's Chevron, and Chevron is exempt from this whole thing. Chevron's continuing to export oil from Venezuela as we speak today. So, in fact, the main what the Americans want in terms of oil, the heavy crude, that's already it's still happening. But Venezuela has ridiculous resources, and it's not just oil. They have everything. They have gold. They have diamonds. You name it. It's ridiculous. The wealth
But
under the soil of Venezuela is beyond imagination.
but again, you can just send a check. The
It's not the
cost,
same. No, no, no,
just
no, no, no. It's not like it doesn't
just let
work
me.
like that. No, let me tell you,
But
it doesn't work like that.
but
There
the
was a
cost
mine.
of
There's a
war, the
Canadian.
cost of
Listen to
war
me.
is
It doesn't
huge.
work like that. Let me answer your question. It doesn't work like that. Individual corporations have tried to. There's a big fight between a Canadian company called Crystalex that made a deal with Chavez for gold mines, and they met all the environmental standards. They were building hospitals, they were building schools, but the capital to create the mine, the Venezuelans didn't have. They needed an outside company and expertise to come in and do it. So it's not like you just write a check. Somebody has to go in and mine the stuff. But
Sure.
Chavez did something. He was starting to get very cozy with the Russians. And he broke the deal with Crystalex, even though there was legitimate contracts. And he gave it to Russia. And then Russia wound up not even developing the mine. In fact, recently, in the Citgo decision that came down just a week ago, Crystalex is the number one benefactor from now the forced sale of Citgo. I don't know if they're ever going to really collect, but no, you can't. Yes, if a country is like, say, Saudi Arabia or even Iraq, if they have a legitimate ongoing oil business that's capable of getting the oil produced, then you can, yes, just buy it. So I get your argument and I know what you're getting at, and you're not all wrong, but that isn't Venezuela. Venezuela needs tremendous capital investment and expertise to get at all these other resources. The whole refinery and oil business is such a mess, it has to be rebuilt. Tremendous amount of capital needed. Now, all that said, couldn't you do that without bringing down the government? And the answer is, of course you could. So this
Yeah,
isn't just about the resources. It's also about
exactly.
the geopolitics. It's about
Exactly.
we are not going to have a government in our hemisphere, China or not China. Like the reason China is important in Venezuela is they've been helping Maduro stay afloat. So, and there is a bigger geopolitical story with China, but you're not coming to power and call yourself socialist, expropriate some stuff that used to be ours. You're not going to stick your finger, go like this at the United Nations. You're not going to defy us, and you're not going to play footsie with the Russians and the Chinese in our hemisphere. So it's very political, geopolitical as well. It's really both. It's not one or the other.
Yeah. Yeah, it is. There's something historically that a point I'd like to make is that the Monroe Doctrine, of course, gets referred to quite a lot, and it was a reference to the President of the United States back in the 1830s, who said that no foreign power is going to interfere in this hemisphere. But the context then was very different, and I think that's important because then it was at the tail end of the Spanish and Portuguese empires, and they were being kicked out, and the French were going to make an attempt to get involved in Mexico. And the United States was then, in a sense, on the side of the anti-colonial, anti-imperialist powers. And that spirit of the American Revolution and the idealism, however false or shaky it may have been at its root, was important in the history of Latin America. The case, architectural point is that the Havana Congress building is clearly modeled on the United States Congress. That sense of the United States as our ideal, our model, and assisted us in throwing out some imperialists is tragic because it certainly changed in the view. But I think it's interesting to remember that that deep history exists.
That's really a whole nother conversation. I agree with part of it, but I don't agree.
Right up to FDR and the good neighbor policy.
Yeah, even the good neighbor policy was a good neighbor policy because they'd already put the dictators in they wanted, so we didn't have to put any new ones in.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah, I mean, the right from the late 19th century, you know, from the Philippines to Latin America, the 1890s into the early 20th century, the Americans have been trying to install pro-American dictators in Latin America, one after the other after the other.
Trump has called Nicaragua, Cuba, and Venezuela a troika of evil, or I can't remember if he said evil or whatever, but it more or less comes to that. I'm surprised he even knew the word troika, actually. But at any rate, they're certainly focused on this, and his Secretary of State, who is descended from Cubans, certainly would like to overthrow those governments. So
well, let me say this. I think because
is that going to happen?
The objective here, the big prize, is get the Chinese out of Brazil. They thought they had their guy in, Bolsonaro, and now he's in jail. And Trump even threatened to raise tariffs against Brazil to force them to let Bolsonaro out, but so far Brazil's told them to go screw themselves. So what they're going after is what they see as the low-hanging fruit. Who are the weakest, most vulnerable states? And who are the ones that are most provocative to us, meaning the American elites? And it's Cuba, obviously, is the number one boogeyman. Maduro's the easiest one to go after. And Nicaragua, they figure, will go down if Venezuela is the linchpin because of the oil. But the real prize, other than the resources of Venezuela, the real prize is Brazil. But they got to work at that, and they are. You know, they're fomenting Christian nationalism in Brazil. The political forces that elected Bolsonaro have not gone away. So the amount of trade China's doing with Brazil is enormous. And so the short of it all is, how is this going to play out? I don't know. I can't say for sure. They are weak. They're vulnerable. Cuba, Venezuela, and Nicaragua are vulnerable to this kind of direct military pressure. And if they stop the oil business in Venezuela, they weaken a lot. We'll see. It might be the Venezuelan people will be completely enraged by this, or maybe too many are disillusioned with Maduro. I don't know. But I do know this has nothing to do with freedom, nothing to do with democracy, nothing to do with the well-being of the Venezuelans, the Cubans, the Nicaraguans, or the Brazilians. What they really want is absolutely pro-American, either authoritarian, and they're quite all right with, dictatorships. You can use the word authoritarian. They're quite all right with dictatorships. And this is the plan. There's always been this division in the American foreign policy elites between those who want to use, kind of what they call soft power, elections, covert action to achieve American objectives, and those who are not shy about using overt military force and power. And those are the people it's no accident they changed the department from defense to the Department of War. It's no accident. This is to have what they call a lethal fighting force. And that's the only way they think they can contend with China is through war. And it's not just contend with China, contend with the crazy chaos in the United States politics. Because
we'll get to that.
Yeah, I'll just end with one sentence on it, which is when capitalism is in deep economic and political crisis, the answer is always war.
Well, let's hope there is no war. However, one place there is a war is in Ukraine after the Russian invasion of 2022. And we're going to be talking about that with Paul Jay in the next segment. So please watch for that. Don't forget, there's a donate button, and please subscribe.